Hey, everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Tactical Leader Podcast. Today, we are blessed to be speaking with Jack Carr, the author of Terminal List and a brand new series that he's releasing, the first one in the nonfiction world, Targeted Beirut. We're going to be diving into a lot of his journey, his story, and all the path that he has led him to becoming a great author. Before we begin, I remind you this show is in support of Advancing the Line for Veterans. If you know a veteran out there that's really struggling with the professional development, workforce development, and the civilian transition, be sure to send them over to atlvets.org to learn more about how we can support them. Jack, welcome to the show, my friend.
Thank you for having me on. I sincerely appreciate it.
Man, it's an honor to have you. There's so many things that I want to dive into with you, but probably not in a public recorded setting. So much more we could talk about one on one. But just to give like a very short background about who you are, I think most people probably know you at this point. A lot of the civilian world, if you will, obviously know you from the Netflix, not Netflix, excuse me, Amazon Prime series Terminal List, where Chris Pratt is a better shot than you. I saw you. I think it was episode two where he
Episode
outshot you a little
three.
bit.
Episode three.
Episode
I
three.
just
So
take him aside though and tell him that if this was real life, things would have gone down a little differently.
man, I saw that. I'm like, Chris Pratt outshot a Navy SEAL. We're gonna have to give him a little bit of crap for that one.
Yeah, no, it
But
was really cool though to actually do that to do my cameo
yeah,
because I got to see how they do the special effects and we did it
nice.
like physical into the glass instead of like adding it after, which I think you can do
Yeah,
with visual effects. But they set up like little mortar tubes, like little metal straws,
yeah.
essentially, right under the dash where the camera can't see them, and they had a little explosive charges and a little ball bearing. And so you have a little guy after, and it looks like an IED. I mean, there's wires everywhere. I mean, it looks like something's just gonna
Yeah.
but there's a guy off to the side with his iPad or whatever, and so you're shooting through the window, or Chris Pratt's shooting in, and he's hitting the buttons on the iPad, and it's sending these ball bearings into the glass and shattering the glass to make it look like bullets. And so that was pretty cool. So that's why I had to have my gaiters on. I had to wear the
Yep.
sunglasses so you don't get glass shards in your eyes. But it was pretty cool. And then they put a squib in the headrest. So when
Yep.
Chris takes an angle on me and shoots me from the side, I throw my head to the side and they hit the squib and it goes boom, puts all this blood up all over the top of the car. So it was pretty cool.
I mean, that's cool, but the real story is Chris Pratt's a better shot than you. Like at the end of the day, nah, I'm joking, man. It was definitely cool to see you pop in there. I wasn't expecting that in the cameos. I was watching it, so it was cool to see you pop in, and a lot of that, it's of course not based on your life journey, Terminal List as a whole, but I see some similarities where the realism attached to the series was phenomenal. To give everybody a little bit of background, Navy SEAL, you served across the spectrum, it sounds like, in the SEALs, where you started on the enlisted side, went into OCS. I'm a fellow OCS guy, so we shifted over to the dark side that does a little bit different things, and you're there for a couple decades where you kind of saw everything from the initial invasion. You were engaged in so many different pieces. You saw the whole spectrum of things developing in the Gulf. A big piece of that is you've obviously transitioned over into being an author. I think that's like a subtitle of most Navy SEALs these days is like author as a part of it.
Third
But
phase,
you're
most of the third phase of Bud SEAL training is all about writing and
how to write.
publicity and marketing. Second
I love
phase is
that.
all about sunglasses and hair gel and that
Looking
sort
cool
of thing.
naturally. Got to look good
So
doing it, right?
pretty natural transition actually.
Yeah,
But
man. What's interesting about your series and you as an author, it's kind of fascinating because, like, I mean, you hit big, especially Amazon Prime. I mean, that's a whole different world to have that adaptation onto the screen where everything's happening. And I kind of want to highlight the journey you took, kind of from like the early days, man. A lot of what I've seen about you, like your early days, 7 or 8, and you decided Navy SEALs. That's where I want to go. This is the one direction I'm going. Can you just talk about that journey a little bit about what made you like really lock in on that, and then how'd you prepare through your teen years to really be prepped for it as a whole?
yeah, well, I think it was just in my blood. Service. My grandfather was killed in World War II, so I grew up with pictures of him and his squadron, and he flew the Corsair, which was
Yeah.
the plane that had the gull wings that would fold up to fit on aircraft carriers. He was a Marine Corps pilot, And back in the late 70s, there was a show called Black Sheep Squadron. It actually started as called Baba Black Sheep, which is the name of Pappy Boynton's, Gregory Boynton's autobiography. But then when it got syndicated, they changed the name to Black Sheep Squadron. And so there is Robert Conrad, actor, playing Pappy Boynton, Medal of Honor recipient, who flew the same type of aircraft that my grandfather did in World War II. So really before internet and obviously social
Yep.
media and all that stuff, it was very difficult to have a connection with that generation if you lost your, in my case, my grandfather, obviously my dad's case, his dad, in World War II. If you didn't know directly somebody in that squadron, there was just no way to really connect with someone who knew your dad or knew my grandfather. So that's kind of the power of popular culture, is that we got to have this connection to that generation through the medium of popular culture, television shows, movies, books. And so we'd sit there and watch those shows. They were syndicated on Sundays, and got to watch those with my dad. But I knew I was going to be going into the military. And then at age 7, I found out what SEALs were because of an old black and white film, once again, popular culture, called The Frogmen. And my mom is a librarian, so I grew up surrounded by books and love of reading, and
And you
asked my
still
mom.
are. For those
Yeah,
who are listening, you have a huge library right behind you.
yeah, I never have had a time in my life where I don't remember. I can't even remember a time when I didn't have a book I was reading or know exactly what I was going to be reading next. It was just my parents made it a natural part of my childhood, just as natural as anything else. It wasn't like I was forced to sit down and read. It was just a natural thing that we did. Reading was natural. So I was very fortunate in that respect, I think, because the reading, not just as far as becoming an author, but becoming a leader and becoming an operator, that reading has been foundational to all of it. But I went down to the local library, did a little research, and back then in the early 80s, you could find the end of the internet if you're looking up Navy SEALs or special operations in general, because there was only a few magazine articles, a couple of chapters in books, but there wasn't much, and you could find the end of that internet. But I just kept studying. Soldier of Fortune magazine. My mom wasn't the biggest fan of Soldier of Fortune. My dad would like sneak one every now and again on his way home from work, getting one at a newsstand and bring it home for me. I should have just subscribed to it back then, because then I would have had almost every single print magazine, Soldier of Fortune. That would have been awesome. But it was kind of like onesie twosies here and there. There's a spinoff called Gung Ho magazine that came out in the mid 80s, and they had a seal, two seals, I think, on the cover. I have it somewhere in a
Nice.
box here, far away. But so anything that I could find on special operations, on insurgencies, counterinsurgencies, warfare, our encyclopedia. I've actually, over here, I have this early internet. I tell my kids over there. I have Encyclopedia Britannicas and World Book Encyclopedias over there. And I collect a collection from like the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s. So you can see how the views of different events in history have changed over time. So I want to make sure I get those before they can just be changed with the touch of a button online. So, but I would go to those and I'd be looking at Vietnam, looking at Korea, looking at World War II, looking at World War One, looking up anything I could find on warfare. So I was on this path. Any sports that I did, I was always think of it in terms of how is this going to help me later as an operator. Well before CrossFit or anything like that,
Yep.
I was doing pull-ups, but changing my hand position, because I saw in these, I think, a Betamax that I could order from the back of Soldier of Fortune magazine about SEALs. They had a little bit of people running the obstacle course in Coronado, California. So I saw, oh, there's a rope. I should put a rope in my backyard. So I put a rope in a tree and I started climbing it. So I was doing those sorts of things, getting up on a bow, on the roof of my bow, and shooting down at angles and at targets instead of just standing there at a regular range. Like I was doing anything that I possibly could at a very early age. And then I'm also reading the fiction. So around fifth grade, certainly by sixth grade, I'm reading the types of things that my parents are reading. So I'm moving from that young adult fiction into the regular fiction that I read and write today. And so I'm reading books by the masters. I'm reading books by Tom Clancy and Nelson DeMille
Yep.
and David Morrell, who created Rambo, AJ Quinnell, JC Pollock, Mark Olden, all these guys whose protagonists back then, for the most part, had Vietnam experience. So if they were, let's say, a private investigator or something in 1985, well, in 1968, they were Army Special Forces, they were Navy SEAL, they were Marine sniper, they were some sort of CIA paramilitary guy in Southeast Asia. So that was kind of the background for a lot of the protagonists back then in these books, and then also on TV and in films. So it was just a part of growing up. I didn't know anyone who was a SEAL. I didn't know anyone who was an author. I didn't know anyone in Hollywood. Didn't know anybody in publishing. But I'm learning on the nonfiction side. I'm actually learning on the fiction side of the house as well. But I'm reading anything that comes across my dining room table as a kid, Time Magazine, Newsweek, that had any sort of a cover story on, at that point, terrorism. And for the Beirut book, I have the Time and Newsweek magazines in the other room that I remember from when I was a kid. So I was just constantly reading, constantly preparing, and then into the SEAL teams. Obviously, that helps because I'm a student of warfare. I've always been a student of warfare, and I'm also a student of the craft of writing, but from the fan perspective, because I'm reading these books at sixth grade, seventh grade, eighth grade, ninth grade, 10th grade, when I don't have any other responsibilities in the world other than to kind of like stay out of the way at home, be seen, not heard type of a deal. But there weren't all these other distractions because you could only play Atari 2600 for so long. If you were going to see a movie, you had to like wait for your parents to take you on a Friday or Saturday night. If you're going to watch a show, if you're going to watch Magnum or Airwolf or whatever you're going to watch on TV, you have to wait till 8, 9, or 10 o'clock at night. You couldn't just get everything on demand anytime that you wanted, that on a device that you're carrying around in your pocket. So I got to grow up in this time where there weren't those other distractions, and I got to be outside and I got to read. And that really has been foundational to all of it.
Which is awesome, and you can tell. I'm more of an audiobook guy these days. I have here in Atlanta, traffic is a beast, so I always turn on a book and listen. And going through the Eternal List series, and you can tell from the perspective of listening to the narrator. It's one of those like you wrote the book in a way that is enjoyable while also bringing out the real life of the military life, right? And I love that piece of it where you read some military books and it's like reading an encyclopedia, right? And it gets the experience across, but it's also, what we studied in the military and more of that study piece. So I love the relatability you kind of brought into your writing. And as you're going through this and getting up into the teen years, ready to enlist, you were over 20 years. So obviously that was like the career choice. You're dedicated to it. Was there a shift in um, leaving high school, or did you immediately enlist? Did you jump right into it? Is that where the ingrained piece really followed through into the military and then right into buds and trying to dive into everything of achieving that goal?
I mean, I knew more about the path into the SEAL teams than my recruiter did. That's certainly true. There was a book, and I have it somewhere over here, that in the back it talked about the dive farer program. So at the time, the dive farer program, which it talked about in the back of this book, which made me aware of it, it allowed you the opportunity to try out for buds for SEAL training at boot camp. Looking back, at least for my time when I went to boot camp, everybody had an opportunity to try out. So all this dive fair program really did was get you to enlist for 6 years instead of the normal 3 or 4.
Good
It's
old
just like,
recruiting tool right
oh,
there.
yeah, exactly. But for me, I've been thinking about this for so long. All I wanted was the opportunity. That's it. And so for me, yes, absolutely. 6 years, boom. Where do I sign? I just want the opportunity to try out. If I don't, make it, that's on me. Um, and so dive fair program, which allowed you to go to boot camp, try out, go through boot camp, go to A school, which is like an MOS type school, so military occupational specialty. Mine was intelligence at Dam Neck, Virginia. So did that. It was a long school, actually. It was like 16 weeks. And then from there, right to buds. And really, I think I could have, what do they call it when you test out of something, like a college course or something like that?
Like the
Anyway,
in stone or capstone, the capstone piece attached to it.
I don't know. There's like, you can test out of a class, you don't have to
Yeah.
take it.
Oh,
Type.
gotcha, gotcha.
So I forget what it was called. But anyway, I think I could have done that at intelligence school because of all the reading that I had done all throughout my life. And back then they were still doing like the silhouettes of like a Soviet sub or a Soviet bomber or ship and things like that. I don't know what they do now, but it was kind of old school back in 96 when I got there. So still pretty old school, still pretty kind of locked in on the Cold War. And especially those different platforms, and a lot of it was identification, as I remember. But I think I could have tested out of that immediately when I got there and not have to spend 16 weeks doing that sort of thing. But that's all, once again, due to reading. And then went right to Buds, into Buds. I think it was like the fourth week of first phase was Hell Week back then. I think it's third now, but regardless. But that's like the crucible. And
Yep.
I think there's something in everyone that between the ages of, let's say, 13 and 20, something like that, you feel this call to be tested and to test yourself and then to prove your value. And I think that comes from the thousands of years where you had to do something like that in order to be accepted by the tribe, accepted by the community. You had to prove that you could add value, that you were essentially, you had to invest in this thing, essentially. Now you don't have to do that, but I think that calling is still there. And that's why so many people generally look at like Marine Corps boot camp is kind of like the general one that people look at as, wow, this is a crucible. I'm going to test myself. I want to serve my country. And then there's other things as well. Any of the boot camps, obviously SEAL training, Q course, Ranger school, anything like that. But I think there's that thing in all of us. And so I got to this place in Coronado, California that I'd read so much about, seen so many videos about. Obviously, not as many videos that are out there now, but for the time, there were a few, not that many, just a few things out there. Like I said, you could have prepared. You could have prepared by watching everything, and that would have only taken X number of hours, not your whole life. Now
Right.
you can prepare to do something, I think, almost too much today, if that makes sense. And I'll get to that when it comes to writing as well. But eventually, you just have to go and do it.
Yep.
Um, and so I was about as prepared, I think, as you could be physically, mentally, emotionally, whatever. I was ready. And then when Hell Week hit, sure enough, just like I'd read about, 80% attrition. So some of the loudest, the strongest, the fastest
Yep.
people were quitting in that first hour, and they were going to have to ring that bell and ding, 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 and self-selecting out of the program. And for me, I was like, wow, this program's working. And then I thought about when things got, hard. But by hard, I mean it's not really hard. You're cold, wet, tired, and hungry. You're getting yelled at all the time, and nothing's ever good enough, and all that stuff.
Yep.
It's kind of like being married. Just kidding. Just kidding.
I'm gonna
Although
edit that out real quick
edit
because
that
my
out.
better half will yell at me for you, and yeah.
Uh, yeah, my wife hears that one. No, she'll laugh. But I thought about all the things that people had sacrificed from the inception of this country up until today that gave me the opportunity to be
Yep.
there on that beach, following my dream into the SEAL teams, or at least testing myself to see if I had that mental fortitude that it took to get into this brotherhood, get into this team. And so I thought about guys storming the beaches at Normandy and Iwo Jima. I thought about guys in Vietnam and planning listening devices on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. I thought of all these things that people had sacrificed so I could be there. And I thought, you know what, I can do another push up here. I can do a few more sit ups. I can get yelled at a little bit more. I can keep running. And so I really put things in perspective. But I think a lot of that study of history really prepared me to be able to put what I was doing there in Buds and SEAL training, what was touted as some of the toughest training ever devised by a modern military. I could put it in perspective.
Yep.
And so for me, gosh, it was just an honor to be there and a privilege to be there. And I respect so much all those people that came before me that allowed me to be there. So did that, got to the SEAL teams. It's the late 90s now, and nothing really going on in the world. We had Kosovo kickoff kind of, a couple years into it. East Coast teams took care of that. I was on the West Coast. Did one deployment before September 11th, and then on September 11th was about 2 weeks into my second deployment. We were in Guam, and phones started ringing up and down the hallway, and we didn't have TVs in our room, but people are banging on doors, waking guys up,
Yep.
and went down to the basement where we had a TV, and we watched the Twin Towers fall. We thought we'd be on planes the next day to Afghanistan, but it took a little while. Got to do a little executive protection gig for what was then called Commander Singpack Fleet as he went around Philippines and a few other places to kind of shore up support, I guess. But I was essentially just a bodyguard and had really not that much training in being a bodyguard. So, but that was interesting to go around, just see that part of it. And then by the time I got back to Guam, I was with one other guy doing that. And by the time we got back to Guam, everything was palletized, all our stuff was packed up, and it was time to jump on the planes and head over. And we still thought we were going to get into Afghanistan at the time because it was still pretty early. But instead, we went to Kuwait and ended up doing the shipboarding operations, which were part of the UN embargo against Iraq. And then Team Three, who used to be doing that, those guys went into Afghanistan. But the shipboarding operations were pretty interesting because it was the only time I did that during my time in the military, and we trained up for it quite a bit. But these ships would come out of Iraq, take a hard left-hand turn at night in rough weather, headed for Iranian waters. So we had to get on these things, take them down, turn them back into international waters, and then turn them over to a prize crew that actually knew how to run these things. So that was pretty interesting. In the dark of night, bad rough seas, climbing up the sides of these things, and then breaching to get inside and take control of them. So that was as an E5, that was pretty cool to be doing that, but not as cool as what was happening in Afghanistan. So before September 11th, that was the thing you wanted to be doing. As soon as September 11th happened, then you're like, oh man, I don't want shipboarding. I need to get into the fight. And we kind of thought for a little bit that we might have missed it. There was always that hope that we could get into Afghanistan because we were in theater, we were right there. We weren't sure exactly, what strategic plans were in play. We were doing something with the ship takedowns, but we didn't get to go on that deployment. And so we kind of thought we missed it. So I came back, turned immediately around, volunteered to head back to that part of the world for another thing. It was really just a training type of a deal, but in a I guess allied country close to Afghanistan, and so did that. Still thinking that maybe we would get to hop over, so didn't get to do that. Then got back, went to OCS because I'd said yes to OCS before September 11th. If it was after September 11th, I probably would have stayed enlisted. But as it happened, it actually worked out quite well. Timing wise, I mean, and you can't really play the system as far as trying to time things. So it just kind of happened that it worked out well because what OCS was like, not quite 3 months or something. Anyway,
Yeah,
it
10, 12 weeks, something like that.
was awful. I blocked it from my mind. I never think about it
Yeah.
unless someone brings it up. It was so awful. And same thing with boot camp. It was like the exact
Yep.
same thing, except at OCS, you have Marine drill instructors yelling at you, and then at regular boot camp, there's Navy people yelling at you. So essentially, you're just getting yelled at and folding laundry
Yep.
for however long that was, which somehow qualifies you to lead men in combat. I'm not quite sure how that works,
It's one
but
of the best training courses I ever went through. What do you mean?
like I said, I block it out. I never think
Yeah.
about it. But then got right back to the SEAL teams, and luckily, a group going to Afghanistan needed extra bodies, and some people on that team kind of knew me from my enlisted time, and so I jumped right in, headed over, got to Afghanistan. What I thought at the time was late in 2003, and then of course that was not really late looking back
Right in
on.
time of just about, wasn't it?
I learned a ton over there.
Yep.
Was with a group that had already done a rotation through, so I was learning a ton. I was just a
Yep.
sponge there. Then got back from that, and then a couple of Iraqs and some Philippines, and finished up in Iraq in 2011 with the drawdown of forces. But it was a good run. Like I said, you always want to be able to do more. I've done more missions, but you kind of also got to go where they tell you and do the best you can. So it was a good run, but also happy to be out now.
That was about to be my next question because there's always that transition period that you hear about. And I was medically retired, so it was one of those you get enough nerve damage and they kick you out, right? So it's like just like a athlete, you lose a uniform, and it's like, what do you do at that point? But also, the air is a lot fresher out on this side of the world, and a lot cleaner as well compared to Afghanistan when I was over there. But it's interesting to see like that progression across your time in. Obviously, I mean, you're already a SEAL, so it's one of those you're at the tip of the spear, literally, or the trident, if you will. And then you kept pushing forward throughout your whole career, trying to get more the officer side. I know you did a lot with the sniper teams in Iraq and Afghanistan, and managed a lot of folks across all those deployments. And as you're transitioning out, obviously you have the background of really being studious. Was it something you initially came out like, I'm going to start writing books, I want to be an author, I want to kind of captivate audiences, or is it a progression to getting into terminal list and everything you're doing now?
Yeah, no, I knew from a very early age, and the sniper stuff was Iraq. That was it was pretty much what I the closest that combat came to being like what I thought it would be like,
Yep.
meaning growing up watching those movies, watching those TV shows, and then being in the JOF in the summer of 2004, where you're maneuvering Bradleys and Abrams and calling in air and just laying
It sounds like
waste.
the army. Hang on, which side were you on?
Yeah, so I was attached to 27
Yeah,
Cav, my sniper
yeah,
team, and just went in there. Colonel Rainey was the battalion commander, amazing guy, and we had a great relationship. And I just showed up and said, "Hey, what can we? Here's our capabilities. How can we help?" And it was about 11 days. I think the whole campaign was about 2 weeks. We were there for 11 days of that campaign. And it was like 24/7, no stops. You're not coming back. You're not going back to a fob or anything. You're out there the whole time. And that was pretty formative. And then getting attached to the agency, which really informs my writing. For those who have read it, that was pretty formative
yeah,
time for me as well. Being attached to one of their units in Iraq in 2006. So it was a good run. It was definitely a good run,
yeah.
but very early in life, I knew military, but then all the reading that I was doing. So age 7, I knew SEALs. Well, from birth, I knew military. Age 7, I knew SEALs. And then I think it was about 6th grade where I knew that one day after my time in the military, I would write, because that's really when I'm starting to read all those books at the adult level, not reading young adult type fiction anymore. And I've moved on from the Farley Mowats and Never Cry Wolves and all those sorts of books. And now I'm in thrillers. And I'm reading all those books, and there's a short story that I read in 6th grade called "The Most Dangerous Game," and they still teach it in a lot of schools. Written by Richard Connell in 1924. And even back then in 6th grade, I told myself that one day I would write a short story, or I would write a novel that paid tribute to that short story. And that was my third novel, Savage Son. So I always knew that one day, I didn't look at them as complementary. I looked at them as completely separate: military first, then author. It wasn't like, oh, the military could help me with this, or no,
Right.
not at all. It was like military first. I will do that as long as it's natural to do that, and then I will write thrillers, and they'll be number one New York Times bestsellers, and there'll be a movie and the TV show. And that was just as a kid. That's just kind of where my brain was, and
Yeah.
I never let anybody talk me out of it. But at the same time, I was preparing for it, even though I didn't look at it that way, by reading all these books and reading them not because one day I wanted to be an author, but reading them because I loved them and reading them for the magic in those pages. And I think it would be a different experience if, let's say, I woke up at age 40 and I'm about to leave the military and I think, oh, you know what, I should give this writing thing a try. What should I have been reading for the last 30 years?
Yep.
And I didn't have to ask that question because I'd already been reading those things for the last 30 years. So I got to read all these books at a time when I don't have to put myself back in 1985 and think about a character who's running around looking for a payphone or trying to find a quarter to make a call, or who's out on a mission who can't be recalled because they don't have a device in their pocket where you can just text them. I'm reading them in the time that they were written. So contemporary thrillers. And so back then I would have thought that something by Ian Fleming or Jean Le Carré early on, like those were essentially period pieces that, or time capsules that take you back to the 50s and the 60s. Jean Le Carré's case, the 70s, and then of course onward. But I didn't look at them as like, oh, how did they do this? Oh, this will be helpful for me later. No, I was just enjoying the story or the magic in those pages. And essentially, what happened is those authors became my professors in the art of storytelling. And I didn't look at it that way until much later, till I started my own writing journey. But I'm so thankful that I was introduced to reading so early, that it was a natural part of my life, because all of those things were foundational. And also, I'm reading those things at a time when I have no other responsibilities, meaning I'm not worried about a mortgage. I'm not worried about taking my wife to dinner. I'm not worried about a car payment. I'm not worried about a job. I'm not worried about getting the kids to soccer practice. All I'm doing is reading this book. That's it. No other responsibilities. And I think that's a different reading. It really became a part of me. And I think that's different than today. If you tried to do that, and then was like, oh, I'm interrupted by the kids, or oh, geez, I got to get to work. I'm going to try to read more at night, 10 minutes before bed, before I fall asleep. No, it was totally different. And I didn't realize that it was preparation for what I would do later in life It most certainly was, and I can't think of a better way to have prepared for what I'm doing now.
Which is awesome because you've turned that into so many things. I know you also have the podcast Danger Close, over 200 episodes that you've invested a lot of time in. Obviously, the writing piece. As
And
you were,
that goes back to military side.
yeah,
So meaning looking at the battle space in Iraq and Afghanistan, you're trying to adapt faster than your enemy. You're looking to capitalize on momentum. You're looking for gaps in the enemy's defenses. So I didn't step into this having any, I don't know anything about business. I know nothing about marketing. I know nothing about any of these things. No social media up until I started writing. No background in any of this. And my wife doesn't either. So what I did is just took a breath and looked at the publishing space the same way I would look at the battlefield in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so when I looked at that, I thought, oh, here's some things that I can do to adapt to an obviously changing environment, obviously different than 1985, 1995, even 2005, even 2015 now. There are different platforms that are essentially in play. So how do I adapt to a changing environment if I'm trying to build a readership? What can I do today that's different that an author couldn't do in 1985 or 95? Oh, here it is. There's social media. There's a way I can thank people that reach out to tell me that they enjoyed the book. And what can I do? I can post things that hopefully add value to people's lives, because it's something I take very seriously, is that people are trusting me with this time that they're never going to get back. And so I want to be a very good steward of that time and of that trust. So that's why everything in the novels has to be about the story. Nothing is about, is this going to sell, or are short chapters better than long chapters now, or how do I make something seem like it's torn from the headlines, or nothing, what's popular, or I'm going to alienate anyone if I say this. Zero. Nothing like that ever enters my consciousness. It is all about the story, because if it's all about the story, then I am in turn honoring that person who's trusting me with time they're never going to get back. So for me, that's extremely important. And then also improvement, just like in the SEAL teams. I want to be a better operator and a leader today than I was yesterday. Same thing. I want the next book to be better than the last book, and the one after that to be better than that one, even if it's just by a degree. And I
yeah.
also want to move the genre forward. I'm not just trying to regurgitate things. I'm building. That's another big piece of it. I'm not just saying, oh, how did this person do it? Oh, I can try to do something similar. No, I'm building off a foundation that's been built by all these other authors, that essentially started with, let's say, The Most Dangerous Game. Obviously, there's a lot of books before that and a lot of stories before that, but let's talk about thrillers and more contemporary thrillers. And I can look at Most Dangerous Game. I can look at Rogue Mail, on the verge of World War II, on the eve of World War II, essentially, 1939. And then we can go into Ian Fleming and Jean Le Carré, and then I can go into Ludlum, and then I can go into Clancy and David Morrell and Nelson DeMille. And I have this whole foundation built upon which to build. And I think that's something that I don't really think about how anybody else does it, but for me, it's about building on what those guys established by giving me this foundation, by writing such amazing books. So, but really, it was about looking at the space as a battlefield and say, oh, I can do this podcast. Somebody couldn't have done that in 1985. If you're going to say thank you to someone in 1985, you have about 5 opportunities to do so on a book tour. And that's it. Maybe one interview if you're lucky, type of a thing. And then someone's going to review it maybe somewhere. I didn't know how rare that was back then. I thought that was, all books. Well, today, now I can thank people on socials. I can put something up there that I think adds value to someone's life. I can have a guest on the podcast where I'm asking questions that I think might add value or be interesting. I can do all these things that you couldn't have done back then. And I think, unless you're an outlier in this space, anyway, in publishing, and there are always outliers in every industry. But if you're not an outlier, meaning someone who can just write the book and then have it take off, like let's say a Twilight or a 50 Shades of Grey. J.K. Rowling and the Harry Potter series isn't a good example because it started earlier on, but you get the idea in that it's something that just takes off. But unless you're one of those outliers, you need to put in the work, and you need to evaluate the battle space, and you need to recognize opportunities to adapt to this changing environment if you want to build a readership. Now, the other side of that is you might not want to, you might just want to write the book and that's it. And that's wonderful if you can do that. But if you have a family, and for me, we have a middle child with really severe special needs who needs 24/7 full-time care forever. So that's very expensive. So, so for me, I would need to build this readership. And I also enjoy thanking people because once again, you couldn't have done that 30 years ago unless you're at book signing. Now I can do it every day on social media by hitting that heart button and thanking someone. So really, the podcast and everything else was a long way of me saying, oh, the website and whatever else. It's
Yeah.
all about adapting to that environment in a way that's real and authentic to well, in this case to me, but for anything anybody else to them.
No, and I love that perspective. I published my first book about 2 years ago, and it was not the book I intended to write by any means. But it's funny the way I say funny. It's interesting to see the way you have a perspective attached to that story and the attachment to it. Where my publisher was leaning different ways. The alignment was one of those. Hey, get this message across, and it's kind of just a rough experience. Like being an author is not an easy thing by any means, and I have a couple more I want to write, but I love the way you really dedicate yourself to the story because it's a shift, right? And I think you do a great job of captivating that in the books. Also, the podcast, man. You had Admiral James Stavridis on the show. We had him as a guest back in April here in Atlanta, and I mean, you've done the gambit, right? You have some amazing, obviously, the Tim Kennedys of the world, the Tulsi Gabbards, high profile folks where you're really captivating great stories attached to it. And a lot of that shifted. Obviously, that's out of the nonfiction world into, or out of the fiction world into the nonfiction world. And it's really interesting the shift now. Obviously, Terminalist is going. There's more seasons coming out of the show. When you started developing that, did you see it coming on the big screen? Did you see it becoming adapted into this piece of really interactive piece with these great stars, these big stars? You'd go recruit Chris Pratt and all of the, I mean, you have a great cast attached to it. How did that kind of come to form?
Yeah, kind of crazy as well. But there's a military connection to it, but there's also goes back to my earliest days. So as a child of the 80s, as soon as I started writing the book, I thought, well, of course it's going to turn into a big screen thing or be on TV. Who should play my main role? And this is like a sentence in. And I thought, you know what? I just saw Zero Dark 30 and I saw the transformation of this guy named Chris Pratt, who was on Parks and Rec, kind of an out of shape, funny guy. And then
Crazy shift,
I
crazy
said,
shift.
yeah, he was a SEAL operator in
Yeah.
Zero Dark 30. I'm like, Chris Pratt will play the lead role. And since I'm picking my lead actor, might as well pick my director. I'm like, oh, Antoine Fuqua. Man, he's awesome. Training Day and Cheers to the Sun and Shooter with Mark Wahlberg based on the book Point of Impact by Stephen Hunter, which is an amazing book.
Yes.
And I'm like, oh, Antoine will direct. And then I had no connection to those guys or anything. So I just keep writing. And then in November of 2017, so it's a few months, the book comes out in March of 2018, so a few months before, I get a call from an old SEAL buddy of mine, and he says, "Hey, do you remember me?" And I'm like, "Yeah, buddy, dude, how's it going?" It's Jared Shaw is the guy's name, and he's awesome, and we're dear friends. And he says, "Hey, man, do you remember what you did for me in the SEAL teams?" And I said, "Nope." And he said, "Well, you're the only person that sat me down in your office when I told you I was getting out. Nobody else did that. You talked to me about transitioning out of the military. You introduced me to people in the private sector, and then you followed up with me and asked me how it was going. No
Which
one
is
else."
huge and very unique, just to like really emphasize that.
Yeah, I mean, I saw it as well. I saw when people said they were getting out, they're kind of put in another pile, and people, especially in the SEAL teams, were kind of like, quitter. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it was a weird thing. I never really got it. If that person wasn't a good operator, then oh, good. See ya.
Yeah.
Good guys, if they're staying in or getting out, I'm going to do my best to help them both, whatever path they choose. And so Jared, awesome guy. And so I'm going to help him as much as I can. But he calls me and he says, yeah, I always wanted to thank you. And I said, no problem. How's it going? And he said, it's going great, but I heard you have a book coming out. And it was the SEAL Grapevine was talking, I guess. And I said, yeah, it's coming out in a few months. I got this thing called a galley copy, which is I learned what a galley was maybe a week or two before. And for those listening, it's like an early copy of a book that goes out to like reviewers and interviewers and stuff like that. And I said, hey, I can send you this thing if you'd like to take a look at it. And he said, yeah, I'd like that, but I'd like to give it to a friend of mine. And I said, no problem. Who's that? And he said, Chris Pratt. And I was like, wow, that is certainly convenient for me because I envisioned Chris Pratt in this role. So I sent it to Jared. He read it first, then he gave it to Chris. Actually, I have a picture of Chris reading it for the first time. And then Chris calls the first week in January of 2018 wanting to option it. And at the same time, another buddy met Antoine Fuqua and gave him a copy. totally unbeknownst to me. And
Yeah.
Antoine wanted it almost at the same time. And so then he called Chris and they ended up working it out. And we're all dear friends now and producers on the show and have some other projects out there as well. So it's yeah, that was a crazy way for that to come about. But like I tell my kids, it's like, hey, never miss an opportunity to make somebody's day. It's and it doesn't mean you have to feel like running around, doing good deeds, but certainly don't shy away from it. And if you have that opportunity to make somebody's day, it can be as easy as like a like on a post or just being kind to somebody. And I mean, not because you want it to come back around, but why not? Why not? Why not err on that side? Why not be a good person and try to help people when you can, if you have that opportunity? So,
And you
um,
never know how much impact that's going to make in their day, their week, the shift of just because somebody's that kind to them. It's
yeah,
huge, simple,
yeah.
but
Yeah,
not
and it's
well
kind of
implemented.
and it's a weird thing to be on social media. Like
Yeah.
I'm not I'm a very much an introvert. I think I learned to be an extrovert in the SEAL teams just so
Hmm.
have your voice heard. But I'd much rather like part of the allure of writing back in, let's say 1985, when I'm dreaming about my future, was being in a cabin in the mountains, writing, sending the book to New York, maybe doing one interview and then going back to writing.
Yeah.
Like that's part of the allure of it. And then about a month before my first book came out, I was like, maybe 2 months or something in there. I was like, oh, okay, now I'm going to look at this. I'm looking at the battle space. Obviously, things have changed,
Yeah.
and I'm going to need to adapt to this. So, hence the social media and podcast and all the rest of it to support the main effort, which is books. But but yeah, it's an interesting space being in social media because man, people are unkind generally.
Yeah.
I should say, because those stand out. There probably are like 98% of people that are really nice and a couple are, not, but those certainly stand out. And
Yeah.
you can get some really mean people that go out of their way to be mean and try to ruin other people's days when you could do the opposite. And if you don't like something, you don't have to say anything about it. But if you like something, you can make somebody's day by saying that and saying how much it impacted you or whatever. Just hit a heart button, whatever. But a lot of people do the opposite and take time out of their day, time they're never going to get back, time
Hmm.
that precious time because we all are on this planet for one ride and we don't know how much
Yeah.
time we have. And a lot of people are choosing to spend that time being unkind to people from behind a keyboard, which is very, very interesting.
And it's something that I think veterans we have such a unique perspective of. I know I lost several guys. I'm sure there are guys across the years that you've lost in different capacities, and we have different perspective of the value of life. I think we really appreciate it in different capacity, and I want to make sure we do highlight the new role, the new genre you're kind of diving into with targeted. Um, there it is, right there.
Hardcover.
Um,
Hardcovers just came. That's why I'm so excited about it.
oh, nice.
Yeah, it came out. It exceeded all my expectations because the galley copy doesn't have like the photos in it. So this
Yep.
has all the photos, and then the photos was really interesting trying to get the photos because from 1983, one of the companies, it wasn't Getty, but it was like something like that. They've been sold like 3 or 4 times over the years, and so I'm trying to contact them to use photos. And they don't even know like who really owns it. The Marine Corps, they just put like originally owned by AP or something. But like lawyers at Simon and Schuster, that doesn't cut it when you're going to have a book out there forever and you're not the United States Marine Corps. So,
Yeah.
so some of the pictures, like we couldn't figure out who owned them, even though you're calling the exact company that owned them in 1983, but they've been sold so many times, they couldn't tell us that they still owned them. And I'm like, I want to pay you to put them in the book. So there's some photos that didn't make it in because of that, but there's some photos that come from personal collections, Marine Corps archives. So it just came out. I couldn't be more pleased with how this came out. And the idea was to capture some of these lessons learned. So we don't have to relearn them in blood. We're not very good as a country of taking past lessons and turning those lessons into wisdom going forward. So I weave a lot of history into my novels. I put a lot of history on social media. And so when I talked to Simon and Schuster about doing a nonfiction series, I wrote down about 3 pages worth of different terrorist events that I'd like to look into. But I kept coming back to Beirut, 1983, because it was such a seminal time in our relationship with that part of the world.
Hmm.
And uh, there was an embassy bombing in April. There was a bombing of the barracks and headquarters building in October. 241 Marines died, largest single, not Marines, servicemen died. There were
Yep.
Navy and Army as well, but largest single day life for the Marine Corps since Iwo Jima in World War II. But between April and October, these guys were in combat. And I didn't wasn't really aware of that part of it until I started talking to these guys and until I started doing this research. But also wanted to humanize this story because if you were going to commit U.S. forces overseas and hopefully take these lessons or lessons in general from the past and apply them going forward as wisdom, but you still decide to commit American sons and daughters to bases overseas. Well, humanizing them was very important also. Like who
Yes.
were the people that were killed? Who were these people that were digging their friends out of the rubble when they didn't have anything other than their bare hands, a K-bar knife, maybe a shovel, or possibly a crowbar, and went to work essentially in a race against time to find anybody who survived in this rebel. So got to talk to those guys, got to talk to Don
Nice.
Howell, who ends up, he's in the basement, thing comes down, the whole building comes down around him. He sees this, he says the Lord's Prayer and sees this little shaft of light, digs himself out. Chaplain
Wow.
Danny Wheeler, he's the last person after 5 hours who's pulled out of the rubble. He's completely trapped in there, can't move at all, total pitch black, and essentially thinks he's not going to make it. And he thinks back to the Louis L'Amour novels that he had read. And his wife had sent him Louis L'Amour novels on that deployment. And he thought of those situations for those characters who were trapped in mine cave-ins and things like that, who got up and kept moving forward and got up fighting. And he thinks that helped keep him alive in the darkness for all those hours. So I wanted to humanize it on one side. I wanted to investigate what was going on at the Reagan White House, who was advising to put Marines ashore, who was advising to keep them on ships in
And a lot of
offshore.
that came off of like declassified materials from the Reagan Commission that he put forward to really uncover a lot of that.
Yep, yep. There's newly declassified documents that really allow you to get a good
Yeah.
sense of what was happening at the executive level, because just like today, it comes down to that man or woman holding, let's say at the time an M16, let's say now some sort of an AR platform, M4 platform, um, and they're the final decision maker in a chain of decision makers that starts with the president and goes all the way down to this 18, 19, 20,
Mm.
21-year-old kid, essentially, that has their weapon off safe, finger on the trigger, as they're watching this car approach a checkpoint that looks like it's way down a little more than it should be. Or maybe it has bad suspension. But that person, that is the last decision maker in that chain. So I want to try to capture that and just keep some of these lessons alive. And then there are striking parallels to today with Hezbollah in Lebanon, essentially the
Yeah.
controlling part of Lebanon. It created a model for future terrorist events because what did we tell the enemy? We taught them that terrorism works. And there's just so many striking parallels, even to Afghanistan, because we put these guys right here, they call them peacekeepers, and we put these guys in a tactically disadvantageous position.
Hmm.
You would Abigate again in August of 2021, same thing. But another striking parallel is that when this building came down, people ran to the sound of the guns and they're digging their buddies out. They don't know if there's another truck coming or not. So you're dealing with that security. You're digging out. The chaplains are administering last rites. There's so much chaos happening here, but they're running to the sound of the guns. Same thing, Abbey huge explosion, 13 Americans dead, scores wounded, and people converge. Service members converge on that site to set security, to try to save as many lives as they can. So for our senior level leaders, military, and then elected representatives, and I don't call them leaders for a reason, they're elected representatives. I want them to realize
Yeah.
what happened, who's at that pointy end of the spear, who's at that side of their decision. So that was all a part of it, and it'll be out there on September 24th.
Yeah, man, and you did the preview of chapter one, is out on your blog on your website, and I read that, and I think the humanization piece of it really starts and is captured right off the bat, which I thought was awesome because I deployed with 7 or 8, 18, 19-year olds under my command, and it was one of those, it's real life that you see that happening. And the book comes out September 24th. You can pre-order it, of course, Amazon, all the places around. You're coming to Atlanta September 29th, where we're highlighting you at an author talk right before we're actually both speaking at Military Influencer Conference. So I'm excited to see you on the big stage at Military Influencer Conference here in Atlanta that following week. But I'm excited about the 29th because we're going to have be able to chop this up a little bit more in person and take a deep dive into this new book, Targeted Beirut. But before I let you run, brother, there's a couple things that I always love knowing. Of course, where can everybody find you? Where can we get a follow the journey? Of course, Jack Carr across all social media, the website. But a big piece, you're putting so much out there now, and it's a vulnerable piece to put your work, your life work out there like that as an author on the podcast, as a SEAL. What's the legacy you want to leave on the world with everything you're really crafting right now?
I don't really think of it in those terms, but you're certainly taking a risk putting things out there. Meaning that back in, let's say, I love going back to the 80s. So let's go back to 19, instead of 85, let's say 88. Uh, if someone hated what you were doing for whatever reason, and they wanted to tell you, whether you're on the screen or maybe you're an author of a book or magazine article, whatever, they would have to find, let's say book, they would have to find the address to Simon and Schuster, let's say. They have to go into the back of the book and see who published this horrible thing for this person that I'm going to take time out of my life to let know that I really despise everything about them. Okay, here we go. This says Emily Bessler books. Well, where's that? How do I find here? Oh, an imprint of Simon and Schuster. Okay. 1230 Avenue of the Americas. Okay. Now I'm going to write or type a letter, and then I'm going to get an envelope, and then I'm going to write that out on the envelope. Then I'm going to get a stamp. I'm going to put it on there. I'm going to put the letter in there. I'm going to seal it. I'm going to walk to my mailbox. I'm going to put it in there. I'm going to put up the flag, and then someone's going to come pick that thing up, and it's going to go. It's going to get to New York, and then it's going to go into the mailroom, and then maybe it's going to go to some assistant or somebody editor somewhere, and they're going to look at it and either toss it, or they're going to open it, read one word and be like, oh, crazy person, toss it. The author would have no idea that
Yeah.
this someone wants to kill them or hates them so much that wants to wish the worst upon them. But now with no investment, so that took some investment for that person to do that. Now zero investment. So this is to your point of putting yourself out there. It's tactically disadvantageous putting yourself out there.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's just the times in which we live. So you just got to know that with the zero investment, there is going to be a certain amount of people that are going to hate you and what you do, and they're going to let you know on social. And for me, it's like, and then your kids see that and all that. But
Mhm.
if you want to be out there and build a readership today, and you're not one of those outliers I talked about earlier, then that's just a part of it. So for me, I try not to look at any of that, try not to let that stuff affect me, make it all about the story and all about putting something out there of value.
Man, I love it. You're obviously doing a phenomenal job with that. All the awards, all the best sellings. Man, I know you're spoke with the publisher, and it's like two every other year you're planning on releasing. So you're writing up a storm, probably in a cabin in the woods somewhere out west, and it's amazing, man. I'm excited to chop up more later this month, and just for everybody, officialjackcar.com. You can get the preview on there. You can order the book, go and pre-order it. Amazing stuff, brother. I'm excited about it. I'm excited to see the paths kind of go in this direction, and looking forward to all of it, man. I want to thank you for your time. I want to encourage everybody, of course, go grab the book, check it out, leave a good review, a positive review, 5 stars or six if we can make that happen, and give some good feedback to Jack and everything he's doing, man. But overall, brother, thank you for your time. Thank you for everything you're putting out in the world, and I look forward to more.
Okay, thanks so much. Looking forward to seeing you in a couple weeks here.
Yes, sir.
Take care.